Hi there, and welcome back to another episode at Station Road. Now, it's been quite some time since I last did any modelling. It's been well over a month, bordering on possibly 2 months. But over the last few days, I've finally had the opportunity to get back into it. So in today's episode, we're continuing on with the Disused Viaduct. Now, as I mentioned, I left this half finished quite some time back, and of course the next phase in that viaduct build was to actually start working on the track bed and doing this disused track layout. So today's episode is covering that, or at least the beginning of that process. And I think this video will be part 1. There will also be a part 2. So I think without further ado, let's just see what I got up to. Right, so there's numerous steps involved here in getting this disused viaduct, the track bed, looking, well, obviously disused. So as I mentioned in previous episodes, of course going back wee way now, the idea was to have maybe one line that was actually still fully intact, although not used, so pretty rusted up and so forth, and the other line has been partially removed or taken up, and maybe there's some sections of rail, maybe there's an area where there is just sleepers, and then another area where the sleepers have been removed as well. So this is of course the girder section down, way down at this end. You can just see it at the top of the frame here, and the plan is that this will be an intact section of rail, then there'll be a section that's just sleepers by themselves. So as you can see here, I've just got some sleepers, I've pulled the rails off, and then down here, this is where I'm gonna not have any sleepers, but of course there'll be the impression in the ballast of where the sleepers used to be. So for this particular area here, what I've actually done is taken a section of Pico track, and in order to get that sleeper impression, I've had to remove the actual webbing between the sleepers. So I've cut all the webbing out of here, but of course when you do that, then these sleepers all start to slide about on the rails and you kind of lose the position. So what I did beforehand is I actually drizzled some super glue down each side on the underside and let that set, and then I've gone through and cut the webbing, and it's mostly kept the sleepers intact and at the correct spacing between each of the sleepers, so that's sort of keeping it all held together without the sleepers sliding about. So the idea of course is that this section here, I'm going to have to very carefully lift it out after I've of course applied the ballast around that particular section of track. So the plan is, because I'm lifting sections of track out, this section here at least is going to be lifted out, is I'm actually going to apply just a thin layer of ballast over the entire track bed first. So it'll just be a single layer, it's not going to be heaped up in any way, so that when this section of track comes out, there's actually going to be some ballast underneath the sleepers, because otherwise you're sort of going to get that weird look where you're going to actually see this grey paint and the hard standing that's underneath here showing through. So hence the various stages. So we'll start with the applying the ballast over just a thin layer over the entire track bed. We'll lift these sections of track out beforehand, and then we'll let that set. Then we're going to apply this track back in place, and of course what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to glue these sections of track down, except for this piece obviously, because I want to be able to lift it out, and I might just temporarily pop some pins in there that I can easily sort of prise out before removing that section of track. So we'll get underway with the ballasting side of things for underneath this track. Now this section of track here, or all of these sections, are just offcuts, leftover bits of Pico flexi track, and I've kind of stitched them together but without rail joiners. I just sort of thought it's going to look a little bit more realistic if it doesn't have rail joiners, so I've actually kind of stitched it together where the rails actually slide into the next section of sleepers and the rail chairs. So it's a little bit flimsy, but we'll just move that out of the way, pop that down there, and then these are just sections that I can take off. So what we're actually going to use here is just some PVA glue, which I've just got in a pottle, and then we've got our ballast in here and a sieve. So we'll just start with spreading some of this PVA glue along the track bed, and of course the idea is that I've really got to wait for this to fully dry before we attach the track on top of this. So as I mentioned, this is really to get that ballast underneath the track so that we've got a more convincing appearance where I'm actually going to have the sleepers removed completely and just have the indentation of where the sleepers used to be. So as you can see, I'm working in my office because we're now really sort of getting, well, winter hasn't started officially, but believe you me, it feels like it has, and it's just too cold in the garage. This would take forever to dry, so of course I've got the heat pump on and I'm working here in the office so that this dries out, and I might be able to work on this process over the next few days. I'm going on the basis this won't take too long to dry, just this thin layer. The ballast that I'm using, this is the homemade ballast I use, which of course I've shown in previous videos probably many years ago now, and it is ground up pumice and it's used for potting mix here in New Zealand. And I'm fully aware that based on those early videos I did of this particular material I use for ballast, that it's not really available in anywhere else in the world, it would seem. Possibly Australia, because Bunnings is in Australia, but otherwise it seems from the comments from these early or videos from a long time ago that it's not available in America, it's not available in the UK, or at least if it is, it's quite a rare thing and therefore it's really expensive. Whereas here in New Zealand, huge bag, 5 kg, it's about $10 or something. It's cheap as chips, and I sift it into 3 different grades. So the grade that I'm using at the moment is the fine size, or the fine granule. The actual ballast that I use on the layout is the in-between one, the middle one, and then the larger chunks that you get in the bag are kind of more like boulders. They would be in terms of 00 scale, but maybe they might be suitable for O gauge. I'm not too sure. But the middle granules, or the medium-sized granules, they're the ones that I actually use for the actual ballasting of the track. And this particular granule that I'm using here, the fine granule, I'm using just as the base on this, because I don't think it doesn't need to be quite as chunky or gritty as the actual ballast itself. It's really just, this is really just to block out the actual bridge trackbed, the grey. So as I said, when I pull up some of the sleepers, you're going to see this underneath. So I'll speed through the rest of this and come back to you at the end. Right, so I'm just pressing this down and making sure that we get most of the granules attaching to the PVA glue. Now, talking about this particular material I use, not really being obviously available in most places around the world, an alternative that obviously, you know, I've seen on a number of YouTube channels is chinchilla sand, I think it is, and I think Richard at New Junction and various other channels, they have got onto this chinchilla sand, which you can get by the bagful pretty cheap, a lot cheaper than Woodland Scenic, and they're quite happy with the results. So that is an alternative, that's an option, a cheap option, if you really didn't want to be paying the premium price that Woodland Scenics and other ballast manufacturers charge. Right, so that's that layer of ballast down. I'm just going to let that thoroughly dry. So of course I'm going to stagger this over several days, so I'm just actually going to leave this and come back to it tomorrow. We'll position this track in place as I was showing before, and then we'll actually apply the second layer of ballast, and of course that will be using the traditional method where that's shaped into place, and then of course using a 50-50 mix of PVA and water with of course a few drops of dishwashing liquid. So that will be in the next phase, so we'll come back when it's all ready to go for that. Right, so I've moved on a little bit further and of course vacuumed up initially all the excess base ballast that we'd glued down yesterday. So that's all been vacuumed up, and then sort of went over with the brush attachment just to make sure that any loose bits were pretty much removed. And then now what I've done is actually laid this track in place. So I just used a card strip as a template to keep the same distance either side from the parapet walls for each of the railway lines, and rather than glue this one down, I've actually just temporarily pinned it in place and not actually pushed the pins all the way in, so they can be easily lifted out, and then of course I can just fill in the pinholes afterwards. This track here, once again, that's pinned as well, and then just the bare sleepers, I've glued these down, so they're just glued down with PVA glue, and we're just going to wait for that glue to fully dry. And then finally down here, this piece of track, which is the section I'm going to lift out once the ballast has been applied. Once again, it's just temporarily pinned in place, but the idea is I'm just going to pull the entire section of track out here. So that's where we're at the moment. I'm going to let this dry, but what I do want to do is add in a few bits of weed growth or grass and things like that that are particularly growing up along the edges of the parapet walls, maybe a little bit in the middle. And what will happen is if I do that now and then apply the ballast is going to work its way around the sort of the base of these components. So what I've actually got here is some strips of static grass that they're pre-made. They're actually made by Hickey, I think it's called, however that's pronounced, and they come in a pack of strips, different colours and lengths and so forth. Generally what I do is I'll take a strip and I'll actually cut it in half lengthways, and then what we're actually going to do is just poke in short little sections of this stuff along the edges here and glue that down as well. So theoretically you'll just sort of see strands and so forth poking up above the ballast, so it would appear as if the stuff is actually growing through the ballast and is not, you know, stuck on top of it. So I'm going to apply a few sections of this, trim this down. There's different lengths in here. That's quite a short one. This one here is quite a long wild one, which I might actually use, and just glue these components into place. So the track is now dried in place, at least this section here with just the sleepers which were glued down, and of course the little wee tufts of overgrown grass and weeds. That's all dry now as well. So with that done, it's a case of applying this ballast over the remainder of the track and just brushing it out. So I felt that maybe this section here, I won't have all the sleepers completely exposed. I quite like the idea that there's a bit of ballast, possibly when they were lifting the rails, that's disturbed the ballast, and the ballast has ended up on top of the sleepers as well. So I think this is kind of getting the effect that I want. So I'm just using a very soft bristle brush that's not really flicking the granules out of between the sleepers. It's just sort of smoothing it over. And I'm not going to make it perfect. So as this is a disused line that's been out of action maybe for a year or two, at the most maybe 5 years, that the ballast of course has not been kept up to any kind of immaculate standard. Even when the line was operating, you know, maybe there was no money to invest in keeping the track work up to any sort of suitable level. So I don't mind it if it's looking a little bit sort of rustic. So I'll carry on with doing the rest of this ballasting, and when we get to our last little section down here where this piece of track I'm going to lift out, I'll pause it at that point and we'll lift this section of track out, and I really hope that it's going to work and actually leave the impression. I've decided I think it might be better to lift the section of track out before I apply the glue water mix, because I kind of feel that if I do that and then try and lift the track out, of course the ballast and everything is going to actually stick to the sleepers and so forth. So I think it might be better to pull the track out while this ballast is still dry. But of course I have to be very careful with taking that out without knocking the ballast too much, but leaving that sleeper impression. Right, so that's the ballasting laid out, and as I mentioned, it's meant to be a little bit more rustic. It's not meant to be beautifully aligned ballast in any way with the nice banking on the edges and things. We're not worrying about that. So now we're going to lift this section of track out, and I really do hope this is actually going to work. And I've got to be quite careful because I certainly don't want to nudge it in any direction that's going to upset the ballast. So I'm just going to grab it by these pins and pull it out. So yeah, I mean, the sleeper impressions are there. Down here, this is where I'm thinking sleepers have been taken out, but also there's been some kind of excavation work going on as well, like maybe some ballast has been sort of pushed about and cleared away, or there's something been going on in here that's kind of disturbed the sleeper impression. So I might actually just dull those ones down a bit so that we've sort of got more of a blend going on in here. But I think that will do. So of course the next step is to spray over this entire lot with just some water. I usually with a few drops of IPA in it, and then of course drench the whole lot with our 50-50 mix of PVA glue. So we'll get that all organized. So firstly I'm going to just spray the area, work my way along in sections, because otherwise you spray it, by the time you get to the next section that's dried out. This is just water with just probably 10% IPA in it, and of course it just helps with the surface tension when it comes to applying the glue. So we're just going to start with this. And it's just a small atomizer bottle rather than using, say, a large spray bottle that you might find in your laundry cupboard. This sort of helps to not blast the actual ballast away from the track too much, and particularly when we get down to doing the sleeper impressions, we certainly don't want to disturb that too much. Right, maybe half at a time. Now in this jar here I'm actually using Mod Podge, not PVA. I've decided in the end Mod Podge is going to be better because it's a matte Mod Podge. So this is roughly 50-50 Mod Podge and water with just a few drops of dishwashing liquid, which just basically helps it to soak into the ballast almost immediately, and it helps to stop the ballast from washing away. And it's just a case of applying this glue with a pipette. Right, so that is all the gluing done. Got a little bit of runoff at the end here, but this is actually not scenic at that end. That's actually the edge of the baseboard there, so I'm not too worried about that. I will get a paper towel onto it, but otherwise we've now just got to let this dry. So as I said, we're working in the office. I have a heat pump in here so I can keep it nice and warm, and theoretically it should maybe take 24-48 hours to harden off. So yeah, if I did it in the garage, it would probably take a week, if not longer. So there we have it. That's completion of part one, and it's basically to get down the disused track, the remaining sleepers, the indentation of where sleepers used to go, and of course one of the lines still intact. Now you would have seen in the footage, obviously that track looks far too clean and pristine, and of course in stage 2 or the second part I'll be looking at the weathering side of the track, getting that really grimed up and looking very disused, rusted rails and all of that type of thing, and also getting into adding additional foliage, overgrowth, weeds and all that kind of stuff that is actually starting to grow up through the ballast. So obviously there's still the girder section, and there's a small amount of buttress on the other side as well that I will do off camera, and it will be pretty much the same technique. So hopefully by the time part 2 comes around, those components will also be ready for weathering and weeds and overgrowth. So I'll leave it there for today's episode. I certainly hope you've gained some inspiration and potentially ideas on your own layout, and maybe somehow incorporating a disused railway line on your own layout. So I'll sign off for now. Do take care, everyone. Look after yourselves. Of course, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will catch you next time. Bye for now.